Margaret, Maggie. Hollis liked to joke that she had raised 2 children. Her only daughter, Heather, and the cedar-sided house that held their memories. For 33 years the modest craftsman sat on a leafy street outside Portland, Oregon, creaking through storms and soaking up laughter. Every corner carried a story. The pencil marks on the pantry door charting Heather's growth spurts, the scuffed floorboards where birthday balloons once skidded, the deep porch swing where Maggie and her late husband Frank spent countless quiet evenings. Now, at 68, Maggie savored a calm retirement. She rose with the dawn, brewed dark coffee, and read the paper front to back. On Tuesdays she volunteered at the library's reading circle. Wednesdays were for gardening and a quick FaceTime with Heather, who worked in marketing across town. Life wasn't flashy, but it felt solid, like the house itself. Heather had been the heart of Maggie's world from the moment she was born. Frank and Maggie had built their life around her education and happiness. Piano lessons, soccer camp, college tuition. Maggie and Frank sacrificed vacations and overtime pay to give her every advantage. After Frank's sudden passing 5 years ago, mother and daughter leaned on each other like 2 beams holding up the same roof. They traded recipes, shared silly memes, and ended nearly every call with the phrase, "It's us against the world." So when Heather arrived one breezy Friday afternoon with a bottle of Pinot and a tight smile, Maggie felt only concern. "Mom, can we talk?" Heather set her purse down, avoiding eye contact. "Of course," Maggie said, pouring coffee for herself and wine for Heather. "Is everything okay?" Heather exhaled sharply. "There's this opportunity. A startup I believe in, green tech, carbon capture, huge potential. I could get in on the ground floor, but I need quick capital." Maggie tilted her head. And I was thinking." Heather hesitated, fingers drumming the table. "If we refinance the house, pull some equity, I could invest. We'd still keep the place. It's just paperwork." Maggie's heart stuttered. The house wasn't just wood and nails. It was security. Frank's voice whispered from memory. "Never gamble the house." Yet she also remembered how he had encouraged bold dreams. Heather's eyes shone with that same fire. "I'd pay every cent back," Heather added quickly. "It's practically guaranteed. Mom, this could set us both up." The plea wrapped itself around Maggie's heart. She wanted to protect Heather, to see her thrive. After a long pause she said softly, "If we do this, it must be strictly legal and transparent. We keep ownership." Heather nodded eagerly. "Absolutely." They clinked glasses. Maggie tried to quiet the unease fluttering in her chest. Weeks later, paperwork arrived by courier. Maggie scanned the documents, noting the dense legal language. Heather guided her through each signature line, assuring her it was a routine equity loan. Maggie hesitated, then signed. Trust, she thought, was a mother's strongest currency. In the following days Heather's visits became brief, her texts delayed. Maggie brushed it off as startup frenzy. But an uneasy feeling grew each evening as she watered the garden alone. Then, one rainy Tuesday, Maggie returned from the library to find a FedEx envelope taped to her front door. She tore it open under the porch light. Notice of sale and transfer of ownership, it read. The buyer's name was a property investment firm she'd never heard of. Sold. Her eyes blurred. The final line stabbed at her. Vacate premises within 30 days. The world tilted. Maggie clutched the doorframe, the letter trembling in her hands. Neighbors later recalled seeing her sink to the porch steps, face ashen. Alice, her next-door friend, rushed over. "Maggie, what is it?" "My own daughter," Maggie whispered, voice cracking. "She sold my home." That night the house felt alien. Shadows stretched long across the familiar walls. Maggie sat at the kitchen table staring at Heather's last text. "Love you, Mom. Trust me on this." The bitter taste of betrayal filled her mouth. She called Heather repeatedly, straight to voicemail. By midnight she left a final message, her voice steadier than she felt. "Heather, it's Mom. I need to know what's happening. Call me." No call came. Morning brought no clarity. Maggie contacted the county recorder's office. A polite clerk confirmed the shocking truth. The deed had been transferred, free and clear. The paperwork included a power of attorney, apparently authorizing Heather to act on her mother's behalf. "But I never signed such a thing," Maggie insisted. The clerk's tone softened. "I'm sorry, ma'am. The document on file bears your signature." Maggie hung up, heart pounding. The signature was indeed hers, lifted from the refinancing papers she'd signed in trust. Heather must have slipped in an additional authorization page. Legal maybe, moral never. She drove home in a daze. Rain blurred the windshield like a curtain between her and the world. In the driveway she lingered, unwilling to step inside the house that was no longer hers. Inside, every room seemed to echo with ghosts. She remembered Frank laughing as he fixed a leaky faucet, Heather practicing piano until her little fingers cramped. Now those memories felt hijacked. Maggie's first instinct was to collapse, to cry until she was empty. Instead she brewed a strong cup of coffee and sat at the table. Years of managing unruly students and stubborn parents had forged a quiet steel in her. She would not let betrayal be the final word. She opened a fresh notebook and wrote one sentence across the top. "This is not the end of my story." Over the next week, Maggie contacted lawyers. Most explained the grim reality. While morally outrageous, the forged power of attorney complicated things. "We can fight," one attorney said, "but it'll cost tens of thousands and could drag on for years." Neighbors urged immediate legal action anyway. Alice pressed her hand over Maggie's. "Sue her, Maggie. Make her pay." Maggie shook her head slowly. "I want justice, but I also want Heather back. Court might win me bricks, but lose me my daughter forever." Still, the nights were long and jagged. Maggie replayed every conversation with Heather, searching for clues she had missed. She found none, only the hollow ache of trust broken. One dawn she walked through each room, whispering goodbye. She touched the carved banister Frank had polished, the kitchen counter where Heather once helped bake Christmas cookies. By the time the moving truck arrived, her heart felt like a cracked teacup, damaged but capable of holding something new. Maggie rented a small one-bedroom apartment on the city's east side. It wasn't much, just a balcony with a view of power lines and a faint smell of espresso from the cafe below, but it was hers. And in that modest space she began the slow work of survival. Each evening she sat by the window, pen in hand, capturing memories of the old house. Not as lament but as record. "You won't erase me," she murmured. "My history travels with me." She mailed Heather one letter, short, steady, free of anger. "Heather, I know what you did. I will not chase you. I will build a life on truth, not deception." She doubted it would spark remorse, but she needed Heather to know she saw clearly. Days bled into weeks. Maggie filled the silence with small routines. Morning walks, library volunteering, an online course in personal finance that she had signed up for on impulse. She wanted to understand every mistake, every loophole that had allowed betrayal to creep in. Knowledge, she realized, was a kind of armor. And deep inside, a quiet determination began to glow. Heather thought she had ended an era. She had, in fact, begun a transformation. Maggie didn't yet know how she would turn this heartbreak into something priceless. She only knew she would. The notebook on her table, now thick with notes and ideas, bore a new title. The first move of her quiet revenge had already begun. Maggie's first winter in the little East Side apartment was the coldest she could remember. Outside, Portland's January drizzle froze into sleet that rattled the balcony railing. Inside, the silence of betrayal pressed in like ice. But Maggie refused to sink. Instead, she treated every long evening as training for a mission only she could see. Her first mission was survival without panic. She made a strict budget on yellow legal pads, rent, food, utilities, and a tiny future fund. She canceled streaming services, clipped grocery coupons, and even sold a few heirloom quilts online. When loneliness clawed at her, she volunteered extra hours at the library, reading to kids who reminded her of Heather at 7, wide-eyed, trusting, still unscarred by ambition. Every dollar saved went into a high-yield credit union account. "Brick by brick," she murmured, as if speaking to the invisible house she intended to rebuild. Not of cedar and nails, but of freedom. Yet one question refused to rest. How had Heather pulled off the sale so cleanly? Maggie's late-night reading in personal finance and estate law began to sharpen into something more purposeful. Through public records, she pieced together the puzzle. Heather hadn't forged a signature outright. Instead, she had slid an extra page into the refinancing packet, a broad power of attorney that, once notarized, gave her sweeping rights. Legally, it was barely defensible. Morally, it was theft wearing a paper mask. Maggie photographed every document, storing copies in encrypted cloud folders and a safe deposit box. Not because she planned an immediate lawsuit, she still resisted that, but because knowledge was leverage. If Heather ever tried to spin a different story, Maggie could quietly lay out the truth. A neighbor from her old street, Alice, phoned often. "You've got enough proof to drag her to court, Maggie. Don't wait." "I'm not ready," Maggie replied each time. "I want more than courtroom victory. I want transformation." It wasn't that Maggie lacked anger. Rage sometimes surged through her like a sudden thunderstorm. But she recognized that pure anger burns fast and leaves ash. She wanted something slower and more fertile, a consequence that would teach. Her second mission was financial self-defense. Maggie enrolled in a free evening class called Wealth for the Golden Years at the community college. Twice a week she sat among retirees and young gig workers, learning about dividend stocks, tax-advantaged trusts, and estate protections. She asked sharp questions, the kind her younger self might have been too shy to voice. One instructor, a former CPA named Brian, stayed after class to answer her cascade of what-ifs. He helped her set up a revocable living trust and a new power of attorney that required 2 witnesses and a security code. "This way," he said, "no one, not even a family member, can sell property behind your back." Maggie filed every paper with the precision of a school principal. Each notarized page felt like a brick in a new invisible house, one Heather could never touch. To generate fresh income, Maggie launched a small online tutoring business for retired teachers. She called it Silver Apples Learning and advertised on community boards and social media. Within months, a handful of students filled her schedule. The pay wasn't lavish, but every direct deposit into her future fund felt like an act of quiet rebellion. Meanwhile, Heather's glittering startup life flickered across Instagram. Rooftop parties, champagne brunches, cryptic captions like "risk big, win bigger." Maggie scrolled late at night, equal parts heartache and watchfulness. Then the images changed. Fewer smiling friends. More shots of solitary coffee cups and vague motivational quotes. Rumors of layoffs drifted through Portland's small tech scene. Maggie said nothing, but she took note. By early spring, Heather's calls returned, tentative at first. "Hey Mom, just checking in," she'd say, voice airy but strained. "I'm well," Maggie would answer calmly. "And you?" "Busy. Startup life, you know." Maggie would let the silence stretch, a gentle space where truth might eventually settle. Then one chilly evening in April, the inevitable ask arrived. "Mom, I could use a little financial cushion. Just a loan until the next funding round." "You'd get it right back." Maggie's grip tightened on the phone. Every cell wanted to rescue her child. But she remembered the night she'd stood alone on the porch holding the eviction letter. "I'm not a bank, Heather," she said softly. "And I no longer co-sign your risks." Silence. Then a curt, "Fine." And the line went dead. Maggie set the phone down gently. The ache of motherhood warred with the clarity of wisdom. But she knew she had spoken the only loving truth left. Boundaries are a form of care. Summer unfolded. Maggie's tutoring business grew. She even mentored other retirees on how to earn online. Her future fund crept past the amount she'd once considered untouchable savings. More important, she discovered a deep satisfaction in guiding without enabling. Still, she worried for Heather. She prayed quietly during morning walks, asking for her daughter's heart to soften before life's hammer fell too hard. By autumn, signs of Heather's unraveling became hard to miss. Friends texted Maggie in confidence. Heather's startup had missed payroll. Investors were pulling out. Creditors were circling. One evening a collection agency left a voicemail on Maggie's landline, politely but firmly seeking contact with Heather's financial guarantor. Maggie returned the call, her voice level. "I am not a guarantor," she stated. "Any debts belong solely to Heather Hollis. Please remove my number." After hanging up, she exhaled a long, steady breath. That single phone call felt like another quiet victory, a public confirmation that she would not be dragged back into the old pattern. December brought an unexpected twist. Heather invited Maggie to a downtown restaurant, expensive, sleek, with hanging gardens and artful candles. Maggie accepted cautiously. Heather arrived late, wearing a designer coat and a forced smile. "Mom, you look great," she said, though her eyes carried sleepless shadows. They ordered salmon. Small talk skated across the table until Heather finally blurted, "I'm in a rough patch. Investors bailed. Rent's overdue. But I have another idea, better than the first. I just need seed money. With your credit history, we could." Maggie raised a gentle hand. "Heather, stop." Heather's voice wavered. "I thought maybe you'd want in. Family partnership." Maggie met her gaze steadily. "I will always want relationship, not partnership in schemes. I won't invest in a second betrayal." Heather flinched as if struck. For a long moment, only the restaurant's soft jazz filled the silence. Then she whispered, "You've changed." "I've learned," Maggie said. "And I hope you will too." They finished dinner mostly in silence. Maggie paid the bill, an act of quiet dignity, and walked out into the cold night feeling both sorrow and strength. The new year dawned with unexpected brightness. Silver Apple's learning expanded. A small podcast she'd started, Golden Years, Solid Ground, attracted a modest but devoted audience of retirees seeking financial resilience. Maggie found purpose in every email from listeners thanking her for practical tips and hard-won wisdom. Neighbors from her old street occasionally invited her to gatherings. One afternoon, Alice pulled her aside. "You've rebuilt more than a bank account, Maggie. You've rebuilt yourself." Maggie smiled. "And maybe in time I'll help rebuild Heather too. But she has to want it." Though she spoke with calm, she sometimes lay awake at night wondering if she'd misjudged, if holding firm might push Heather too far into despair. Then she'd remember Brian's counsel from class. True help isn't bailing someone out. It's giving them the tools to stand. Those words steadied her like a lighthouse in fog. 9 months after the eviction letter, Heather's world finally collapsed. The startup filed bankruptcy. Credit card companies froze her accounts. Former friends stopped returning calls. Late one evening, Heather dialed her mother at last. The voice that Maggie heard was stripped of bravado. "Mom, I think I've lost everything." Maggie listened, heart aching but steady. "Where are you?" "Downtown. My lease is up next week. I don't know where to go." "You're welcome to visit," Maggie said quietly. "Not to borrow but to talk." There was a pause, heavy with all the words they had not said. Then Heather whispered, "Okay." When Maggie hung up, she stood by the window watching rain trace slow rivers down the glass. For the first time in over a year, she allowed herself to cry. Tears not of weakness, but of a love strong enough to wait. She set out clean linens in the guest corner of her modest apartment. She didn't know what the next conversation would bring, anger, repentance, or silence, but she knew this. The long game of quiet revenge had done its work. Every patient decision, every firm boundary, had prepared the ground for the deeper change she still hoped for. The knock came late on a February night. Rain hissed against the apartment windows like soft static. Maggie, half dozing in her recliner with a mystery novel on her lap, jolted awake. 3 hesitant raps sounded again. She opened the door to find Heather, drenched and shivering, mascara streaked like black rain across her cheeks. The confident daughter who once strolled through startup launches and rooftop parties now looked like a frightened college kid. "Mom," Heather's voice cracked. "Can I come in?" Maggie stepped aside. Heather collapsed onto the small sofa, hugging herself as though trying to hold her life together by sheer will. "I messed up," she whispered. Maggie brought her a towel and a steaming mug of chamomile tea, then waited. She had learned the discipline of silence. It left space for the truth to walk in unforced. Heather stared into the cup as words tumbled out, halting at first, then in a flood. "The startup's gone. Investors pulled out months ago. I maxed every credit card. I tried day trading to fix it. Lost more. I haven't paid rent in weeks. They locked me out of my place tonight." Maggie listened without interrupting. Her heart ached, but the teacher in her knew that growth blooms in honest soil. "And the house," Heather continued, voice barely audible. "I thought flipping it to an investment firm would double our equity. I believed I could buy it back and surprise you. Instead, they gutted it, flipped it again, and pocketed everything. I used a power of attorney page you signed when we refinanced. I told myself you'd thank me later. She broke off, burying her face in her hands. "I was trying to give us both a better life. And I destroyed everything." For a long moment, the only sound was the tick of Maggie's wall clock. Finally Maggie spoke, calm but firm. "Heather, you didn't just risk money. You risked trust. And trust is harder to buy back than any house." Heather's shoulders shook. "I know. I don't deserve you." "Maybe not," Maggie said softly. "But you're still my daughter." Heather raised red-rimmed eyes. "What can I do?" Maggie disappeared into her bedroom and returned with a single envelope. Inside was a printed plan she had been quietly refining for months, titled Steps Toward Financial Responsibility. It outlined a no-frills budget, a list of non-profit debt counselors, and a step-by-step debt snowball repayment strategy. "This is the help I can offer," she said, setting the envelope on the coffee table. "Guidance. No checks. No bailouts. Real help." Heather swallowed hard. "You're not kicking me out. You can stay here until you're stable," Maggie said. But there are conditions: truth, accountability, and a timeline. You'll meet weekly with a counselor. You'll show me every plan and payment. This is about rebuilding character, not just credit. For a moment Heather simply stared, as if unsure whether this was mercy or punishment. Finally she whispered, "I'll do it." Maggie nodded. "Then we begin tomorrow." The next morning they sat side by side with laptops and a thick binder of bills. Heather's debts looked like a storm cloud. 5 credit cards, 2 personal loans, and unpaid taxes. Maggie guided her through each item with the patience of a seasoned teacher. "First, we call every creditor," Maggie said. "No hiding." Heather winced. "They'll yell at me." "They might," Maggie agreed. "But facing truth is step 1. Over the next week Heather made call after humiliating call, setting up payment plans and freezing interest rates where possible. Maggie never spoke for her, but she stayed nearby, a steady lighthouse when shame threatened to sink Heather's resolve. There were tears and relapses. One Friday Maggie found a new online shopping package on the doorstep. "Heather," she said quietly, holding up the box. Heather flushed. It was a flash sale. No excuses. "Return it," Maggie said. "Every dollar counts." Heather did, cheeks burning. Gradually, small victories stacked up. Heather secured a part-time marketing job at a non-profit housing agency. Her first paycheck, modest but hard-earned, went straight toward the highest interest card. When she showed Maggie the receipt, her eyes shone with something deeper than pride: integrity reawakening. Spring approached with the smell of wet earth and new beginnings. Yet the old house remained an open wound. "I can't drive past our street," Heather admitted one morning. "I feel sick knowing strangers live there." Maggie sipped her coffee. "It's just a building now. What matters is what we build inside ourselves." Still, she understood the need for closure. One sunny Saturday they drove quietly to the old neighborhood. The cedar-sided house looked freshly painted, almost unrecognizable. Heather gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles whitened. "I ruined this," she whispered. "You made a terrible choice," Maggie corrected gently. "But the life of our family isn't trapped in those walls." They sat for a long time, watching sunlight filter through blooming dogwoods. Something in Heather's rigid posture softened. "I'll never forget what I did," she said. "Good," Maggie replied. "Remembering isn't punishment. It's wisdom." By summer, Heather's debts were shrinking. Her non-profit job became full-time, bringing steady health benefits and a circle of grounded friends. Maggie noticed subtle changes. Heather no longer chased luxury labels, and she spent Saturday mornings volunteering at community food banks. One evening after dinner, Heather surprised her mother with a gentle confession. "I used to think success meant having more than anyone else. Now I think it's keeping promises, starting with the ones I make to myself." Maggie reached across the table, squeezing her daughter's hand. "That's a richer lesson than any inheritance I could leave." Their relationship, once fractured, began to feel like a quilt slowly stitched back together. There were still rough seams, moments when old hurts flared, but each week brought a little more trust. Meanwhile, Maggie's own quiet empire continued to grow. Her tutoring business thrived, and her podcast audience doubled. Letters poured in from listeners inspired by her clear, down-to-earth advice on protecting retirement savings and setting family boundaries. One email struck her deeply. "I thought my son's gambling would ruin us. Your story taught me to love firmly and say no. He's now 3 months clean. Thank you." Maggie read it aloud to Heather. "See, even our pain can feed someone else's healing." Heather smiled faintly. Maybe someday I can help other families the way you've helped me. You already are, Maggie said. Every choice you make now is a ripple outward. The true turning point came one crisp October evening when Heather knocked on Maggie's bedroom door holding a plain white envelope. "I need you to see this," she said. Inside was a statement showing every debt. Credit cards, loans, back taxes, stamped paid in full. "I'm free," Heather whispered, tears sparkling. Maggie hugged her, heart swelling with gratitude. "I'm proud of the woman you're becoming." Heather shook her head. "Mom, you did this." Maggie pulled back, eyes steady. "No, you did. I only held the light." They stood in quiet embrace, knowing that this freedom, unlike quick riches, had roots deep enough to last. As winter approached again, Heather began saving aggressively. She created a dedicated rebuilding fund, not to replace the lost house exactly, but to create a foundation for a new chapter. "I don't want us to live like we're waiting for disaster," she said. Maggie nodded, deeply moved. "Whatever home we choose next, it will be built on honesty." They started to dream out loud. A small riverside cottage where they could host Sunday dinners, plant tulips, and maybe even start a community garden. This time there would be no hidden pages in the paperwork, only open plans and shared decisions. Maggie often thought back to that first rainy night when Heather had knocked on her door, broken and scared. The memory no longer felt sharp with betrayal. Instead, it felt like the exact point where their true relationship had finally begun. The last of the February rain surrendered to a sky washed clean, and with it the heaviness that had lived in Maggie's chest for nearly 2 years began to lift. She noticed it first in small ways. The way coffee tasted brighter, the way laughter didn't feel like a betrayal of grief, the way she caught herself humming while she folded laundry. Healing rarely announces itself with trumpets. It arrives like a soft knock you almost miss and then, once welcomed, fills every room. Heather kept showing up. She showed up to the early shifts at the non-profit housing agency, where she managed community outreach and helped renters untangle predatory leases. She showed up to weekly dinners at the little apartment, bringing crock-pot stews and the occasional lopsided pie. She showed up with spreadsheets, with the kind of humility that doesn't hang its head but rolls up its sleeves. When shame tried to creep back in, she would name it aloud, and then name the choice she was making instead. The naming turned monsters into dust. Maggie showed up too. She kept silver apples learning running, expanding her circle of retired tutors and picking up new students who sent her handwritten thank you notes in careful script. She recorded her podcast twice a month, voice steady and warm as a quilt, telling the truth about wills and beneficiaries and power of attorney traps, about budgets that keep promises, about how love isn't a credit card and forgiveness isn't a blank check. She did not name Heather on the air. She didn't need to. The story lived between the lines, in the weight of her pauses and the clean edges of her sentences. By early spring, tulips erupted in every median and front yard across the city. Maggie and Heather drove to the river and walked along the path where cottonwoods spilled green confetti into the wind. "You know," Heather said, pausing to watch a golden retriever leap after a stick, "I keep thinking about our house. Not the old one, this future one we talk about. The one with enough porch for 2 rocking chairs, with a kitchen that smells like cinnamon, with a garden that has more herbs than we'll ever cook with." Maggie smiled. "The one where Sundays aren't measured in square footage but in who's sitting at the table. And where the deed has exactly 1 signer," Heather added, managing a laugh and a wince in the same breath. They set a goal that afternoon, not grandiose, not performative. They would look for a cottage near the water, modest and sturdy, no shortcuts, no schemes. They opened a joint planning document titled Cottage Honest, and put a date at the top. They didn't rush. Sometimes the most radical faith is steady patience. The first houses they toured were wrong in predictable ways. One sat nearly under a freeway overpass that hummed like a beehive. Another had charm until the inspector found mold blooming behind the drywall like a secret garden gone to rot. A third felt like a hotel lobby, perfect surfaces that begged you not to live too loudly. It was Maggie who said, "We'll know it when we hear it." Heather glanced at her, puzzled. "When we hear it?" Maggie nodded. "Some houses make a sound. Not creaks. A sort of yes." The yes arrived on a shy April morning, a block from a slow bend in the river where herons picked their way through bright water. The cottage wasn't trying to impress anyone. Cedar shingles weathered to a soft gray, windows that looked like eyes that had seen things and kept their counsel, a small porch with posts thick as a handshake. When the realtor unlocked the door and stepped aside, Maggie heard it, a low, welcoming hum, as if the place exhaled. It wasn't the old house and it never would be. That was the point. Heather squeezed her hand. "Mom," she whispered, as though they might scare it away if they spoke too loud. "I hear it." The inspection took time. The offer was fair, not clever. There were no side deals, no investors lurking behind acronyms, no paperwork slid in at the bottom of a stack. Heather watched every clause like a hawk and insisted on 2 independent notaries. "I want this recorded in heaven and at the county," she joked, and Maggie laughed, the kind of laugh that clears dust from the corners of your lungs. A week before the closing date, an email arrived that neither of them expected. It was from a state attorney's office, subject line, "Restitution Program. Real estate fraud settlement." At first Maggie assumed it was spam, but the letterhead was real. The investment firm that had first purchased her old home, the one that had flipped it twice and walked away, had been swept into a broader investigation. As part of a settlement, a victims fund had been created for seniors whose properties had been transferred under dubious powers of attorney. The letter invited Maggie to submit documentation for consideration. She sat back, breath caught somewhere between her collarbone and her mouth. "Heather." Heather read the message twice, then again, face still. "Mom," she said carefully, "this isn't a trap. It's a door." "We didn't sue," Maggie murmured, as much to herself as to her daughter. "I told God I didn't want blood. I wanted wisdom. I set down anger because it was too heavy to carry. And now," she trailed off, her eyes widening with a grief-tinged wonder. "Now this." They gathered the documents, copies, photographs, dates, the maddeningly tidy lines of that old misused signature, and submitted everything, not as a demand but like a patient handing over scans to a specialist who might finally say, "Here's what happened and here is what it cost." Weeks passed with only a polite acknowledgement in reply. They didn't obsess. On Saturdays they met the contractor at the cottage to measure for bookshelves. On Tuesdays Heather stopped by with takeout stir-fry and updates on a pilot program at the non-profit aimed at teaching seniors how to read deeds and spot fraud. "We're calling it Solid Ground," she said. "I stole the name from your podcast." "Borrowed," Maggie corrected, smiling. "With attribution." The settlement notice landed on a Wednesday afternoon in May. Maggie opened the email at her tiny kitchen table, then read it again on the balcony just to be sure because sometimes truth requires sunlight. Proved. The amount wasn't extravagant. It wouldn't stitch up every tear. But it was honest restitution. It would replenish savings, pay for the porch railings, seed a small emergency fund for anyone who might someday need a place to fall without breaking. Maggie felt gratitude ride up her spine like heat after a long shiver. Heather arrived breathless from work, hair escaping its clip, and found her mother standing at the counter with one hand over her mouth and the other pressed flat against the printed letter. "They approved it," Maggie said, voice thin with emotion. "They saw us." Heather laughed and cried at once. She reached for her mother and pulled her into a hug that felt like the opposite of theft. "Mom," she said into Maggie's shoulder, "this is what I mean by karma. Not the internet kind where someone trips on the sidewalk after being rude. The real kind. The circle closing because you refuse to close your fist." They talked late into the evening about what to do with the funds. A dozen possibilities sparkled and faded. It was Maggie who found the answer without trying. "We'll take what we need to finish the cottage," she said slowly. "We'll shore up my retirement. Then we'll start a little thing. Nothing flashy, just a seed. The Frank Hollis Promise Fund. Small grants for seniors who need a consultation, a filing fee, a locksmith, a bus pass to the county office. We will be the ladder I needed that day I sat on the porch with that letter in my hand." Heather nodded, tearful. "And we'll record a podcast episode so others know the warning signs. And I'll build a workshop at the nonprofit to teach families how to do paperwork without power plays. And," she stopped herself smiling, "and we'll plant a garden. Tulips for the years we lost. Herbs for the meals we'll make. Tomatoes because they're hard to mess up." They closed on the cottage beneath a sky so blue it seemed undecided between spring and summer. There were no champagne flutes, only paper cups of lemonade, a plate of peanut butter cookies, and a few old neighbors who came to clap and hug and say the kind of sentences people save for weddings and funerals but should use on ordinary Tuesdays. The realtor passed over the keys, and Maggie held them flat on her palm, studying the way sunlight spun gold on their teeth. "You're just metal," she told them softly. "But what you open is mercy." Moving day was a procession of boxes labeled in Maggie's precise hand. Kitchen, saucepan, books, mysteries, podcast, Mike, Frank, photos. Heather set her own modest boxes in the spare bedroom, just enough to say "I live with you," but not so much as to say "I depend on you." They argued gently about where the mugs should go and whether the couch should face the window or the fireplace. "The window," Maggie insisted. "We should always be facing whatever light we can find." The first Sunday dinner in the new place was smaller than the memory of old Sundays and somehow more complete. Alice from the old street came with a casserole that could have fed a battalion. Two of Maggie's tutoring students arrived with parents who looked as shy as new parishioners. Heather's supervisor from the non-profit brought a folding chair and listened more than she talked. Someone set a jar of tulips in the center of the table. Pink, yellow, red. Like a time-lapse of apology turned into promise. After the plates were cleared and the last guest drifted home, mother and daughter sat on the porch steps, ankles touching, the river whispering somewhere beyond the hydrangeas. The air smelled like cut grass and the sharp, clean beginning of night. A moth stitched sloppy figure eights around the porch light. Cicadas tuned their tiny instruments. "I used to think revenge was a courtroom," Heather said, voice low. "A headline. A triumphant speech where you walk away and the other person shrinks. But the worst thing that could have happened to me would have been getting away with what I did. Your revenge was letting life be my teacher. It was your no. It was your quiet. It was watching me sit in my own mess and handing me a mop instead of a magic wand." Maggie reached over and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her daughter's ear the way she had when Heather was 12 and surly about everything, and only wanted her mother when the lights went out. "Revenge isn't mine," she said. "Justice belongs to more than one person, and grace is nobody's trophy. But you're right about the quiet. I had to let the echo come back to you." Heather shifted, resting her head lightly on Maggie's shoulder. "What do you think Dad would say about all this?" Maggie pictured Frank on this very porch, elbow propped on a knee, eyes crinkled at the corners. She pictured him fixing a leaky faucet by humming at it as though it were a stubborn child. He would say we did the hard thing. He would say the house matters, but the promise matters more. And then he'd ask me if the tomatoes were getting enough sun. They laughed, the kind that bends your back and rinses your eyes. In the quiet that followed, Maggie felt a kind of settlement arrive that had nothing to do with the Attorney General. Not payback. Not even payoff. Just the clean click of a door that had been hanging slightly ajar for years finally closing on its hinges the right way. Summer slid into the kind of golden autumn that makes even the hardest cities look merciful. Heather built the first solid ground workshop at the nonprofit, filling a church basement with seniors and their adult children, stacks of blank forms, and the promise, spoken and kept, that no one would be shamed for not knowing what they had never been taught. Maggie sat in the front row and took notes like a diligent student, her presence more blessing than audit. When Heather finished, the room stood to clap, a little ragged at first and then sure. The Frank Hollis Promise Fund began with 5 small grants: bus passes, notary fees, a hotel night for a woman whose locks had been changed on a legal technicality. The fund didn't solve the world. It didn't need to. It made tiny straight lines in a place where everything had been scribbled. Each time Maggie signed a check, she said, under her breath, "For the porch steps you haven't sat on yet. For the house you carry with you." The podcast episode about deeds and POAs became her most shared. Listeners wrote from Ohio and Alberta and a town in Cornwall with a name Maggie had to look up on a map. They told their stories, and she read every one, sometimes answering at 2 a.m. with tea cooling beside her. She told them what she had learned. Make a trust before you need one. Choose a power of attorney that protects your future self from your present sentimentality. Never rush a signature that changes a life. Teach your children the math of limits and the algebra of mercy. Make a plan for your money so you're free to spend your love without fear. On a cool evening in late October, Maggie and Heather planted tulip bulbs along the cottage walk. They worked in easy silence, hands deep in soil that would keep secrets until spring. With every bulb, Heather said a year aloud, 2018, 2019, all the way to the present, and with every year Maggie answered not forgiven but remembered. It felt right that way. Memory as compost, forgiveness as the new green that would push up through it. When they were done, they sat side by side on the porch, dirt under their nails, the kind of tired that makes sleep honest. The sky had turned the color of peaches left too long in the sun. "Do you ever think about the first night?" Heather asked. "The envelope on the door. The way the house looked when you realized." "I do," Maggie said. "But it doesn't hold me. I hold it." Heather reached into her tote and pulled out a small folder, its corners softened from handling. "There's one more thing," she said, suddenly shy. She handed the folder over. Inside lay the deed to the cottage, recorded and true. Maggie's name stood there alone, crisp and correct. But at the back, neatly tucked, was a single-page letter notarized and witnessed in the precise way Maggie had taught Heather to insist upon. It read, "I, Heather Hollis, recognize that a home is more than a structure. It is a covenant. I pledge that no financial decision I make will ever again be hidden from my mother, whose wisdom is our family's roofline. If I fail, I ask for consequences that teach. If I succeed, I will share. This is not a legal document. It is a moral one. It is my promise." Maggie read the page twice, then looked up to find her daughter's face bright with something new. Not relief, not even pride, but willingness. "It's not enforceable," Heather said with a lopsided smile. "I know. But I wanted it written somewhere outside of me." "It's enforceable where it counts," Maggie replied, pressing the letter to her heart. "And anyway, I know a very stubborn witness." They laughed again, the sound braided with crickets. The river kept up its quiet narration of rocks and time. Some nights later, as they hosted a small gathering for the launch of the Frank Hollis Promise Fund, A man in his 70s lingered after the others had gone. He had brought a casserole in a dented pan and washed his own dish without being asked. He stood in the doorway now, hat in hand, searching for words. Finally he said, "Years ago, my boy took my truck without asking and totaled it. I didn't talk to him for 3 years. Tonight I texted him. Your story. It told me where the road back starts." After he left, Maggie and Heather stood quietly, the house breathing around them. "This," Heather said, looking at the empty casserole pan as though it were some kind of relic, "this is the priceless part, isn't it?" Maggie nodded. "Houses age. Money circulates. Promises endure." They turned off the lights and stepped onto the porch. The tulips, still only a hope hiding in soil, were already there in their minds, a row of color that would break open at just the right time. The stars scattered themselves like salt on a black tablecloth. Maggie took a breath that seemed to reach all the way down to the day she first held her daughter and believed, fiercely and without evidence, that love could outlast anything. "If you're listening to this and wondering what to do with your own heartbreak," she said softly, almost to the night, almost to the audience that had gathered around their story by word of mouth and podcast app and the fragile, ferocious human need to know that repair is possible, start by telling the truth. Make a plan. Guard your golden years with wisdom. And do not mistake softness for weakness. The quiet road is the strong one. Heather slipped her arm through her mother's. "And when you can, plant something," she added. "So you'll have color when the hard season ends." They stood there a while longer, two silhouettes in a doorway that finally fit its frame, listening to the river say yes to the dark and yes to the dawn that would follow. And when they finally went inside, the house made that small sound again, the one Maggie had heard the first day they crossed the threshold, the hum of a dwelling that knows it is not merely shelter but witness. If you found any part of their long road back speaking to your own life, share it with someone who needs a light and come back next Sunday dinner. There will be a chair for you on the porch. If Maggie and Heather's journey touched your heart, remember, love with wisdom can rebuild any broken home. Your own story of forgiveness could be the light someone else needs.